When do we start seeing data? BLS is going to take some time, and we're never going to fill these gaps that we have for the month of October, are we?
No, I mean, there was some data collection that was already in process prior to the government shutdown for what was to be released in October. The government shut down on September 30th.
So we get a stale September jobs report.
We'll get a stale September jobs report. We may get some CPI indications, kind of a mini release, and then we will hopefully start to get back to collecting data. Some of the data that goes into, especially the jobs report, is reported on a pretty continual basis. It is not a survey that, phone calls or online surveys have to go out to households. It's kind of incoming data. So it's sifting through that, analyzing it, and then getting the surveys back on track. That will probably take a couple weeks to get those stale reports. And then hopefully by the beginning of the year, we'll have an accurate picture. But of course, the Fed will have to meet once again before that without that full picture.
So let's talk about where we currently stand from what we do know. What are the indicators that you've been watching for as we try to piece together a picture, particularly related to the labor market? Because of course, we're talking about 2 missed monthly jobs reports.
Yeah, unfortunately, the private sector data, as you both know, is not always the most high quality or the most sensitive. We've seen ADP kind of all over the place, but what we have seen is record numbers of layoffs. When we look at, the Challenger report, that to me is a little bit concerning. We had started to see layoffs tick up, but they were still within a normal range. And we got information from Challenger last week that they were really at historic highs. The other thing I have been watching is among small businesses, how hiring has been faring. And we've seen both in Gusto, another private payroll processor, and ADP, those small business numbers not look great. Small businesses obviously employ about half of workers in the United States. They have been hit the hardest by tariffs, just unable to kind of increase inventories and keep cash on the books as interest rates are very high. So those are the couple of things I am looking out for. And then we've gotten some indications that seasonal temporary hiring will be down through the holiday season, which is typically a big kind of push in many areas. We saw Spirit Halloween really slow their openings, and we are seeing for the retail spending ahead of the holiday season that not to look so great given where consumers are. And so a lot of retailers are holding back on hiring.
Karoline Leavitt was just asked about the lack of data. She's holding forth in the White House briefing room now, the press secretary at the White House. Check this out, Liz. October CPI and jobs data likely never to be released for October. I guess you can't go back in time and get that snapshot. Will it be more difficult for the Federal Reserve to understand the impact of this government shutdown if we start putting numbers on data like this, between 1.5% to 2% growth this quarter, according to Kevin Hassett? What happens, though, when you cut off 42 million Americans from SNAP benefits for a month? When do you know what the impact of that is?
The SNAP benefits, even knowing when they'll be turned back on is something we don't know right now. A lot of states were able to send out at least partial benefits, either because governor stepped in or we had a couple of late-breaking court rulings forcing some of that money to go out. The administration has not committed to a specific schedule for when those benefits will resume going out. I think, there's a tension in wanting to know what the effects of the shutdown were after the shutdown is over, and for the Fed especially and other policymakers to know what the current state of the economy is. I would put those in the opposite order of we need to know exactly what our economy looks like right now so we can make decisions about interest rates, about fiscal policy. It would be nice to have that historical look back, but missing 1 month is not catastrophic. I think the bigger issue is that we are unlikely to have that data by the Fed meeting in a couple of weeks here for the current snapshot, which is the more concerning thing to me than missing those data points. But, we saw the president a couple times in the last week say inaccurate things about how prices are down. We saw that Walmart report about a Thanksgiving meal costing less when, in fact, they were just moving around all of the items that go into that. I think the more and more that the administration tries to rely on fuzzy private market data as they, withhold that information about the typical reliable government reports, that to me is more concerning.
I did want to ask you also about the broader backdrop of the economy here when it comes to tariffs. You brought up tariffs. It was also part of this conversation that we just heard with Kevin Hassett, and he said that the administration is considering some of these other tariff authorities as the Supreme Court looks at the big one, IEEPA, those broad-based tariffs based on emergency powers. We heard President Trump earlier this week suggest that there could be $2,000 refund checks. How do these headlines jive when you have the administration looking at dispersing money from tariff revenue, but also preparing a backstop if those tariffs get struck down.
In the Supreme Court arguments last week, we really saw the solicitors struggle with how to respond to questions from the justices about these revenue effects of the tariffs. They say they're minor. The president tweets out that they're going to be $4 trillion. The president truths again that they're going to be $3 trillion and they're going to fund stimulus checks. I mean, it's really all over the place and quite incoherent. I'd say on the checks, I am not running out to put $2,000 on my credit card because I think the government will be sending me a check in the next 30 days, and I would not suggest that anyone else do so. And then, I think we're likely, even if the Supreme Court does weigh in on those emergency IEEPA tariffs, the Trump administration has signaled, and they have even started, over a dozen investigations using those other authorities on specific inputs. So that could be, copper, aluminum, semiconductors, but we could see those spread to other industries using other authorities, some of which, could allow him to enact time-limited across-the-board tariffs of 10 to 15%. Others would require 6-month, typically, investigations before they could put higher rates on them.
So there would be an interruption then, in waiting for the next round of tariffs to come in that world. Would the money need to be paid back during that period of time? I guess the court needs to decide that, Liz, and I won't make you decide that now. I guess the question I have is, what would happen? The president says it will ruin the country. It'll destroy the country to pay back what he says is $3 trillion. It seems to be in the billions, not the trillions. But what would be the impact of writing checks like that?
There's kind of two separate things happening right here. So one is if the IEEPA tariffs that have been somewhat collected over the last 6 months by customs, there are lots of delays and lots of kind of mixed implementation of those. If the Supreme Court strikes down those tariffs, there are already companies lining up as part of class action lawsuits trying to get those refunds from the Treasury Department for the tariffs that they've paid. I think it's very unlikely those would then be passed on to consumers, though some consumers did directly pay those tariffs on, shipments to their doorstep.
So then you get the class action lawsuit going.
Correct, which is a whole other disaster in and of itself. And I think you have both seen how long it takes for lawsuits to work through our court system. So that's one aspect. The president is separately suggesting that these magical dividend checks will be sent out to consumers that are completely separate. So those would be funded by the revenue from the tariffs coming in, the tariffs which could, of course, be interrupted by the Supreme Court's ruling. But as you said, there are not $3 to $4 trillion worth of revenue. We have at most seen, $200 to $300 billion taken in revenue. And the administration has drawn on that pot of money to pay for this, that, and the other over the course of the last 6 months, trying to pay troops or trying to pay SNAP benefits or, paying for the ballroom. I mean, he seems to view this as kind of an unlimited slush fund. Whether he spends it or tweets it out, this is really not a thing I think the American people can rely on.
We actually have a great story on the Bloomberg terminal about how there's already a case forming for a class action so that we could see those tariff refunds paid out more broadly, because we know that the issue of universal injunctions has come up before with this administration on it. Sticking on tariffs, we heard from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier today, who said that we could see some potential planned reductions when it comes to things like coffee, bananas, other food that we don't grow here in the U.S. How would targeted reductions work, and does that make a dent when we're talking about potential pass-throughs and prices for consumers?
The targeted carve-outs are, very complicated to implement, as are the broad sweeping tariffs that the president has put into place. They also seem to, the administration has historically not stuck with the thing that they announced. So do I think that it will be smooth sailing for exempted coffee, bananas, et cetera? No, because none of these tariffs have been smooth sailing. I think this is a really fascinating press tour that, both Bessent and Hassett are doing right now, where they realize that American people are very frustrated with higher prices. The president campaigned on lowering prices on day one. Last week, he walked this back saying that's a 2026 priority for them. So I guess this is kicking off that tour. But, a couple of months ago, the president said groceries. What a fascinating word. I wonder where that word came from. And I guess now he has figured out that, in fact, the American people do care about their grocery prices. We, of course, do not grow coffee or bananas here in the United States. It's not so much about onshoring supply chains. It's just genuinely impossible. And so now they are exploring these, limited carve-outs. We have seen the president look at other limited carve-outs. There was a deal struck with Apple where they would be able to get out of semiconductor tariffs. These have been, implemented in different ways, and in many cases, tariffs are not being collected anyway because there's so much confusion at the border. So do I expect, bananas to magically become cheaper at the grocery store in the next couple of weeks? No. I mean, coffee's up 20-30% over the past year. And there are a number of other grocery costs that are not so impacted by the tariffs. Ground beef is up double digits over the past year, given other issues in the economy that tariffs will not really affect, though I guess the president is looking at increasing imports from Argentina to fix that problem.
Well, he does cite beef pretty frequently. That is, the whole grocery store is cheaper, but beef is the cost that we need to deal with. And of course, he's running afoul of our ranchers here in the United States, the cattlemen, who have been not terribly happy about that idea. What is his obsession with grocery? You brought this up. He says it's an old word, a beautiful word, a strange word, grocery. And then he started using BLT as a descriptor of what grocery is: bacon, lettuce, tomato. Has he ever been in a grocery store?
That's a great question.
Being serious about that.
I would love to have, a Bloomberg reporter ask that the next time that they get a press briefing question. It's a good one.
You remember the gallon of milk with George Bush? This used to be like treacherous ground for a politician. It's not anymore, is it?
Yes. I mean, I remember President Joe Biden opening up a bag of chips and saying there's not too many Doritos in here. Right. I think, maybe we'll see as part of this press tour, Donald Trump go into Kroger and take a couple things off the shelf. I would be curious.
That's typically when this stuff happens.
How long it's been since he went into a Kroger and pulled a couple things off the shelf. But, we saw in elections last week in Virginia, New York City, and New Jersey, and even in Georgia, where, power bills were on the ballot, that Americans are really frustrated by the prices they're paying, whether it's at the grocery store, at the gas pump, for rent. And I think the president hates to be an unpopular guy. His approval ratings on the economy and inflation are in the tank. And he realizes that he's going to have to get acquainted with the beautiful word groceries if he wants to turn it around.